When I was 10 years old, I began to take swimming lessons. I loved swimming lessons, and unfortunately, I had some sort of problem where I kept getting cramps in my legs. The coach called me to the side of the pool and told me to get out, and he said to go with him into the locker room because he would help me take care of that problem. And I was a very trusting 10-year-old. I'd never had any reason not to trust adults, and especially people in positions like that. He began to massage my legs higher until he started abusing me. He told me that it was normal, this was how he was helping me. Eventually, I quit swim lessons. I just knew something wasn't quite right. I kept getting funny looks from the girls in the pool. Even after I quit swimming lessons, I would wake up in the middle of the night with cramps in my legs and a sense of terror. So as far as I know, he was never arrested, never called to account for it. And I think about the countless victims from this man in the locker room. And back then, men were not allowed in women's locker rooms. The only reason he had access was that he was the swim coach.
In March of 2015, my boss at the YMCA came to me. I was the communications director, and she asked me to draft some talking points about what she imagined was going to be a kind of controversial topic. And I read the documentation and my heart sank. And I realized that what we were talking about was gender identity-based locker room and bathroom usage. And I just couldn't believe it, because this was so unlike anything the Y had ever done. But I also just experienced it through so many different angles. But primarily as through the experience of a survivor of sexual trauma. From a young age, from the time I was in diapers, I was being sexually exploited. I had never had a showering experience that was safe. I mean, I was an athlete all the way through college, and so locker rooms are settings you're gonna have to go into a couple times a day. I showered in my underwear all the way through college, which is sad. I hadn't, up till this point, identified myself, in a professional context as somebody who had experienced sexual trauma. You just keep that to yourself for the most part. But I needed her to understand that this was important and that we really needed to think this through. They gave me two choices. They decided that I could either be terminated on the spot, or I could resign with severance and medical pending my silence. I'd been silenced enough in my life. My abuser, this was our little secret. I couldn't speak. That wasn't an option for me anymore. I'd gotten this far. So I just decided that there was no way I could actually take that money and that severance. I think when people look at these policies and these regulations as they're coming up across the states, they have a real sense of compassion, and that's good. And they form these ideas that they ought to really support these things and these measures because they think that it's a compassionate thing to do. I think what they're not considering, and what I'm hoping that they will, is that this has such devastating implications for people like me. The presence of a male of any variety, whether he's somebody who identifies as trans or not, whether he has deviant motives or not, that's irrelevant to the reality that for survivors of sexual trauma, to just turn around and to be exposed to that is an instant trigger.
When the abuse started, I was 8 years old, and there was many exposures to pornography. There was many times of seeing them naked before any piece of clothing was removed from me. It progressed to rape, full rape. It continued until I was 10, and it was another victim who spoke up at school and said something was going on, that it came to light. I've only been telling my personal story publicly for a few months. I don't enjoy it. This is not something that I want to do. I do it a little under protest, but I do it because I know there are so many kids out there. There are so many kids out there already being abused. There's so many kids out there that pedophiles, they're just looking for a chance. It is an addiction like no other. And yet we've just created a law that makes it easier for them to access their victims. I have no doubt that the person who abused me would have been more than willing to use that as access as well. No doubt.
If you look and appear to me like a woman and you come into the bathroom, I'm not gonna question that. I don't use the bathroom of your choice. My biggest issue was the fact that the law was so ambiguous that anybody can go in there. My brother can walk into a women's room. The business can't ask him to leave if he just claims to identify as a woman or doesn't even bother saying anything at all. People are afraid, and with good reason, because they've had experiences where they were in places where they were vulnerable and someone hurt them.
I was told there was a junior high student that wanted to use the opposite bathroom. So the school district decided to make the policy that all the bathrooms were gender neutral. My children don't want to use the bathrooms anymore. That is huge for a child that's been sexually abused. I have 6 children currently. I've adopted 5. They have unfortunately gone through some major things in their little lives, some sexual abuse. My one daughter has a lot of accidents. That's embarrassing to her, obviously, at her age. One reason that she has many accidents during the school day is because going to the bathroom, even with girls, that's huge for her to be able to pull down her pants because that's how she was abused. And if she doesn't feel safe, she's not going to use the bathrooms.
I think it all boils down to that right of privacy. And is this something worth preserving? We think it is, but they're just trampling on it, saying, no, you need to be educated, you need to get with the times. And if you don't think that way, you're a bigot, you're hateful of transgender people. And that's just not the case at all. It's just students and parents wanting what's best for their kids and wanting to know that when they drop them off, they're not going to be exposed to someone of the opposite sex in the restroom or locker room. And the courts have recognized that right to privacy. Our laws recognize the right to privacy, but we're seeing more and more school districts and even our own Department of Education neglecting and trampling on that right to privacy.
A response I've heard from legislators is that I need to be more educated on the issue. And I find that kind of interesting because I do have a master's degree in marriage and family therapy, and I have worked with children who have been sexually abused. And I can tell you that it doesn't take much opportunity or access for a child to be abused. I am well educated in that fact.
I really strongly dislike being told that I need to be educated about this issue because to me, it doesn't matter how much I read or learn about a different community than mine. That doesn't ultimately change what I do already know in the education that I learned the hard way about predators. And that's a piece of this conversation that has been missing because we've got this big national push to end rape culture, to prevent sexual crimes against women. And half of that, a very large portion of that, is knowing how predators operate. These policies were only in place for less than a month in Washington State before somebody actually went in to a women's locker room while teenage girls were getting ready for swim team and went in there and determined that he was allowed to be in there. He presented as a male, he didn't look like a female, he didn't even pretend to look like he was a female. But he went in there and they asked him to leave and he said that he had a right to be there and nobody could prove that he didn't. And so the message that sends really loud and clear to those teenage girls is that, is that that's okay. And that a grown man can come and watch them shower. And we're not gonna do anything about that because he feels like he's a female. That tells me that the lack in education isn't on our side.
I am a trans woman and a parent, but I totally reject this law. It's a law that allows for any man to be able to say he's a woman and access women's spaces. I personally think there should be a separate space for trans or anyone where they can access, and at the same time it protects trans safety and it also protects the safety of anyone and the privacy of anyone, especially women and children. In a time where so many sexual assaults go unreported, we're telling them that their boundaries don't matter. When they say no, people won't listen. They'll be blamed for being uncomfortable. I think it's time that we care for women and children, that we care for the concerns of women and children, care for the safety of women and children, and this passing this law is not the way to do it.
I have been educated. I have been educated very well of what happens when boundaries cross, the absolute devastation. I wish I didn't. And I wish that we lived in a perfect utopia where you could trust everyone at their word. But we know that we don't live in that world. And we know that people will abuse this.
At the end of the day, what I really want is for everybody to be safe and everybody to be respected. But I think there are a lot of ways that you can accomplish that without compromising the safety and the dignity of such a large portion of the population.